Hi, welcome to a new episode of Ilanomics. The new financial year has begun, and what a juicy beginning it has been. So many decisions were announced by the government on the 31st of March, and some decisions that had to take effect on the 1st of April were also reversed within, say, 12 hours. And you know what we are talking about. That was a small savings rate. But the focus of our discussion today is not that, but something which has much more impact on the economy over the next 5 years. And that is the inflation targeting regime for the RBI. The government kept it at what it is, which is between 2 and 6% with an average of 4%. This is something we had discussed with you a couple of months back when there was a lot of talk about this should be changed, this should be done away with. But thankfully, as Professor Patnaik says, the government has not tinkered with it, and this is a good call. Hi, welcome to this episode. Uh, you've been very clear about what the government should do, and the government has listened to you. You're pleased with that?
Very pleased with that. The inflation targeting framework was put in place in 2016. And since then, there was a lot of criticism of the framework itself when the MPC was put in place and the framework was formalized. There were people who were saying that this means that real interest rates are going to be very high, and or that there is going to be no transmission of the monetary policy rate cut or rise whenever that happens, or that the CPI is the wrong measure, there should be a different measure, and many other things. Now, in the last 1 year, this criticism had in fact increased because of the pandemic, because of the sharp drop in GDP growth, where people had criticized the framework itself. And, many people had said that it should be changed. The law that had been put in place, which was an RBI amendment, which was an amendment of the RBI Act, of the preamble of the RBI Act, and some provisions that had been sections that had been added to put the monetary policy committee and its role into the RBI Act. That act required that every 5 years, the government look at the target, the 4%. While it was given that it would be the consumer price index, that would be the measure of inflation that the MPC would target. But what it did require was that every 5 years, the government was required to go back to the table, discuss with the RBI, and then say whether that number of 4 and the band around it should be changed or not. Now, all this period that we have seen, inflation was roughly within the range, other than towards the end when, due to unusual circumstances, it had started rising. And then it later came back down again in the last couple of months. But the number 4 was again something that was people were saying should be changed. So, for example, Dr. Rakesh Mohan, who was former deputy governor of the RBI, said that it should be 5%, and others said that the measure should be different. But there was a lot of risk in bringing in instability. So because you change it and then you could be changing it again, and if the government indicated that it was not happy with how the RBI or the MPC had tried to target inflation, then it could change expectations. And it had barely settled down. It's a very, very new mechanism that had been, a new framework that had been put in place. So I think this is one of those times when we say that doing nothing was actually the best policy. When not changing the framework, not changing the rate, would give policy stability in a period when there is already so much uncertainty in the system. And so it was, I think, important that the government did not change it. And that is what's happened. So yes, I'm very pleased.
This argument that has been made that by focusing too much on inflation and focusing on keeping inflation in that band, the RBI has not been able to cut rates and focus on growth. I mean, that's been the criticism, for some time now. And you have those numbers. I think we shared those numbers last time in your column. Uh, can for the benefit of viewers who may have missed that, can you just, tell us why this argument is not such a strong argument?
See, if you look at the Monetary Policy Committee meetings that have been held in since the framework was put in place, then other than in about 4 to 5 meetings, and that too, for example, that was in very special circumstances. So, for example, in the meeting that took place right after demonetization, when the RBI felt that there would be a unfavorable supply response and there could be high inflation, though I did not agree with that then, because I felt that there was a short, there was going to be a huge demand constraint, and turned out to be right. But whatever. And other than in those 4 5 meetings, if you look at the decisions, it's been basically either rate cuts or in some cases, no change at all. Particularly after Dr. Das came in as governor, we've been seeing almost every meeting has given us a rate cut or it has not been changed. There have been no rate hikes. And, given the present environment, can we keep going down and down and down further? Because after all, savers respond to what the real interest rate is. And, you saw how overnight, in fact, an attempt at cutting interest rates for savers was turned around and changed, because you can't have a situation where the government wants to borrow more and more, but you keep, reducing interest rates, because then where will the savings come from? So I don't agree with the argument that the inflation targeting framework has led us to high real interest rates, that we haven't had rate cuts. We've actually had rate cuts. And those rate cuts have been consistent with the inflation target, because, inflation was low. It wasn't that demand was on an upswing or that the economy was overheating. So rates could be cut very much in very much consistent with the inflation targeting framework.
You make a very categorical statement in your column, and we will share the link to the column in the notes description of this video. You make a very categorical statement, Ila, that there is no trade-off between growth and inflation, which takes off from what you have said so far. That's very categorical, isn't it?
Yes. So, if you look at the literature on the experience with growth and inflation, then what it suggests is that when countries face high inflation, actually that leads them to a crisis. So high inflation does not give you high growth. High inflation actually gives you, in a medium term, low growth. So, in that one period, yes, you might get higher growth, but eventually, very soon, not even, in the long run, but very soon, it leads you to lower growth, because growth becomes very volatile. Now, it has also been seen that inflation rates of above 7% are actually consistent with lower growth. So when emerging economies try to adopt higher inflation to achieve fast growth, rapid growth, so let interest rates be too loose, then very soon with a very loose monetary policy, you start having other difficulties. For example, you get higher inflation, you get exchange rate depreciation, you run into a current account deficit, you run into trade problems, you borrow from abroad, that leads you to balance of payment crisis. So I'm not saying that it always happens, but very soon, very often the experience is that high inflation above 7% gives you lower growth because of the crisis that it can lead to. And that is why the inflation targeting frameworks, which basically said inflation should be low and stable, they are seen as pro-growth, because that trade-off that might have been assumed to be, might have been thought to be in place earlier, has now been seen that there's no trade-off. Below 7%, there's actually no trade-off. If you ensure low and stable inflation, you actually get a more stable and higher growth rate, and you don't have those crises that you witness when you have high inflation rates.
Ila, let's take some questions. We have a handful of questions coming in. Uh, Gurinder, who's a Twitter user, asks us, he says, basically, Prime Minister Modi has given up on growth and will target inflation to claim credit for the lowest inflation ever in a pandemic induced demand recession, making virtue out of a vice. Am I right? He asks.
No, I don't agree. So let's go back to the budget of this year. The budget has made attempted to push growth. Now, whether you look at the infrastructure investment, whether you look at the plan for privatization, whether you look at some of the other initiatives like the PLI, productivity linked incentives that have been given, the attempt is, I mean, these are very difficult conditions, with the virus coming back, and you may not get high growth. But I mean, I don't really feel that it is. My assessment is not that the government has given up on growth and is only aiming for low inflation and low growth, and claims to, will claim that as the victory. Honestly, I feel that while low growth, low inflation is important, but it is an environment of low and stable inflation that is going to give you growth. So if you ensure low inflation, you actually have a better chance at getting higher growth than you do if you were to have uh, you know flyaway inflation rates. I mean, we've seen countries, you've heard of Zimbabwe's inflation rate. We've seen many countries that have very high inflation rates. How many of those are seen to be having high growth? Not not to my knowledge.
Next one is from Karthik Jaiswal, and it takes off from what you refer to other countries. He's talking about the Thai example, which is also something you have talked about in your column, Ina. What are your thoughts on the Thai example? Thailand is shifting from core inflation to headline inflation as the target.
Yes, so I think we also examined core inflation as the target when India was adopting inflation targeting. And the discussion there was, is core inflation that Thailand has adopted something that the public should look at, and therefore that is what should be in the law? Or should it be something that is actually in the internal workings and models of the Monetary Policy Committee members when they make the decisions about whether to raise or lower the repo rate? And it was felt that even Thailand was talking about moving away from core inflation because people can't relate to it. If you talk to households don't know what is core inflation. I mean, we economists and statisticians can sit down and chop off the most volatile component of inflation. So, I mean, just to inform readers who are not aware of the difference between core and headline inflation, core inflation can be measured in a couple of ways. One can be that you, month after month, you chop off the most volatile elements of the basket, and then you keep only the stable elements. That's one way of doing it. The second is that you choose what you will chop off, even if they were volatile that month or not. So, for example, you can chop off food and oil prices, which are usually very volatile, and then you are left with core inflation. So, people have looked at various ways of doing it. In India, we usually just say core inflation is headline inflation minus food and oil inflation. Now, households, particularly in India, given that the basket, the average consumption basket consists of almost 47 to 49%, half is food. Households cannot relate to core inflation. So, if you go out and ask people, do you think महंगाई बढ़ रही hai? And they will think of their consumption basket, and they think of vegetable prices, or they think of oil prices, petrol prices, and they would say that yes, inflation is increasing. So I think Thailand has moved to what we chose, which is headline inflation, and that's good news.
Ila, we have Pratik D and Sonia asking a similar question. This is a slightly unusual question, but also Pratik is thanking you for imparting us with your depth of knowledge. You're most welcome, Pratik. And let me use this opportunity. We are trying to do this at the best of our ability, bringing you deep insights into the economy. And it would be a great help if you could subscribe to the print, because we need more and more people to take subscriptions and support us. You know how bad the economy is, and especially tough for the media. So the more people subscribe, the better content we can get, the better videos we can produce, and keep going at the same level of consistency and build on it. So yeah, Pratik, do spread the word. So Pratik and Sonia are asking. Pratik asks, "Could you please recommend your favorite books on economics?" And Sonia is saying, "Suggest some reading of books for understanding the Russian economy."
So I would say reading of books on economics depends on what your present level is. Okay. So if you've done your bachelor's, then one would recommend high level books. And if it is your first entry into the subject, then I would recommend different levels of books. But basically, open economy macro would be for today. There would be micro, but again, it depends on if you studied micro, then that's different. But if you haven't, then just basic any Samuelson, books on macro, Rubenfield and Pindai, any of those books which are very very basic books would be good enough. For macro, I would recommend books on open economy macro, uh, Don Bush and Fisher. Or so it's a subject that actually requires rigorous teaching and training, not very easy to pick up from reading books which are not textbooks. You should of course read newspapers and try to understand what's going on, but it does. I've gone through my BA, MA, MPhil, PhD in economics. Uh, so there's a lot that one would do as rigorous studying. I'm not sure if that helps.
Thanks, Ila. I'm sure the young viewers would be hugely benefited by those thoughts. This one is from Anant Gupta, and Anant is asking us: Is 2 to 6% really an acceptable band? Because at 2% inflation, would the inflation not be counterproductive?
You see, most developed economies have 2% as their band. And if you look at what they've been doing in the last 1 year, particularly after the pandemic, is that they are saying average of 2%, which means it can go above and below 2%. Japan is trying to push it to 2% from the lower side. So 2 is pretty acceptable in advanced economies. Now, for us, that is only the very lower end of the band. We've got actually a 4%. The 4 is our target. 2 to 6 is not the target. 2 to 6 is the place where if you are, then you don't have to go to explain that you have not been able to meet the target. Otherwise, the RBI has to explain to government why it could not meet the target, and that condition is there in some countries, even for a point inflation rate, whereas we put it as a band because here, first of all, it was absolutely new. Second, let's all of us understand that the monetary policy transmission mechanism is very, very weak. We don't have much of a bond market functioning. We don't have a competitive banking sector. So whenever there is a change in the rate, particularly when there is a rate cut, that doesn't get easily transmitted to the rest of the economy. So that is the reason why you have a very wide band. So that's why the 2 below the 4 is that you tolerate a lot more on either side when you don't have a very good mechanism. Also, I think as the inflation targeting framework matures, my this band will narrow. So, in my vision, just in what I would expect is that 5, 10 years down the line, because every 5 years the government has to review this target. So let's say 5, 10 years down the line, next time or the next time, the band may actually narrow. So if we stick to 4, we might make it 3 to 5. But let's see. That remains to be seen.
This one is a not tricky, but that depends on what you want to say. It says the question is from Sarthak Agrawal. He says, "What are your views on the paper published by Surjit Bhalla and Karan Bhasin on inflation targeting?"
So I was actually a discussant for that paper when it was presented at ORF a couple of weeks ago. And, yeah, I've got a slideshow, discussion slideshow there, and you could go. I'm sure, I don't know whether they have it on their website or not. I never went back and checked, but if it is there, then you should go for the details there. But let me come to my thoughts on that paper. So, first of all, I don't even agree that other countries are moving away from the inflation targeting framework, which is what is claimed. In fact, a lot of countries in the last 5 years, since we adopted inflation targeting, have actually formalized their inflation targeting framework. And the details are there on the net to see, and I'm planning to write also about it. Some we made some mention in this column. Second, in terms of the measure of inflation, in fact, I've also worked on that, and I have a paper with a couple of my co-authors. It's an NIPFP working paper, and it was published in EPW, where you can see how CPI is the best measure of the measures that we have. The WPI is nobody's basket. Sujit and his authors say that the private final consumption expenditure deflator should be used as the inflation rates that you target. Apart from the fact that nobody can really relate to it, would you even know? I mean, would any of us, I don't know, would any of us know what has been the trajectory of the PFC deflator in the last 5 years, 10 years? I don't know. So that deflator gets made by using WPI, and then comes at a frequency of one. I mean, maybe you can create it quarterly also, I suppose, but pretty much annually. Whether it's quarterly or annually, that is not something that you can then use because the frequency is inadequate. Second, nobody uses it. So Sujit cites a survey that the US does to say that they have started doing that survey. And so that is something that we should do. Even if we start doing a survey, I don't know how different and better it will be from the CPI and what would be the weights that we would use for different for the basket. But even if we do the survey, we would have to wait and see how it performs. So I don't find any of those arguments, that is to move away from the framework and go back to the multiple indicator approach, which the RBI used to have. So that's not persuasive. I don't think there is a better measure than the CPI. None of the measures proposed, whether it's WPI, whether it's a GDP deflator, whether it is the PFCE deflator, the private final consumption expenditure deflator, or the WPI, are in any way better measures than CPI, not only in terms of their basket, their frequency, or in terms of the way households can relate to them. So that is why almost every country uses the CPI. So I did not agree with that paper. And I'm glad to see that nor did the government.
Okay, Ila, that's touche. Siddharth Kulkarni. In fact, Siddharth talks about something that has been reported. January inflation, February inflation, how the numbers have been wavering. Siddharth says, are the current WPI numbers in January concerning? Prices of inputs such as steel are increasing. Should we expect cost push inflation?
See, recently, the most recent data, last month's data, is showing that in Asia, input costs seem to be rising. So some of the analysis suggests that this is due to the supply disruptions that happened because of COVID and the lockdown. Now, oil again is something that the price of oil has been increasing. So I would be concerned that if this is the trend, and given particularly that COVID has not gone away and that we are seeing a very scary second wave of COVID, if this does continue to spread and it does lead to supply disruptions and input prices continue on the trend that they have been, then yes, I would also be concerned.
There is a question from a viewer who calls himself or herself Vailval. Does inflation in India is inflation in India caused by black money, and can digital payments help reduce inflation?
No, inflation doesn't get caused by black money. Inflation gets caused when there is either a mismatch between demand and supply because of either supply disruptions, or there is a mismatch because there's too demand is rising too fast, which could be because credit is rising too fast. It could be a monetary thing. Sometimes it is also because of inflationary expectations. The kind of demand price spiral that happened, particularly in Latin American countries, when wages were indexed to inflation rates. So if all of us had DA sort of built into our salaries, and every year they had to go up by a certain percentage, and at the beginning of the year there were wage negotiations which put that rate at 10, then input prices would get pushed up by 10. So these are the different, whether supply side factors, demand factors, monetary factors, inflationary expectations. These are what cause inflation to go up in any economy as well as in India. Black money, if I may define it, is basically money either what has been accumulated through illegal activities. Uh, could be drugs, could be crime, murder, whatever, illegal mining, any illegal activities, or it is money on which you have not paid taxes. So it's the income is legal in the sense that I've not got it by doing something illegal. But if I don't pay taxes on it, then it is black money. Now, neither of these are the sources of inflation. So if black money remains a certain amount, let's say 50% of whatever is the total, there are people who don't pay taxes on their incomes. And that stays like that, and it remains that, it does remain a high proportion. They continue to buy and sell what they are continuing to buy and sell year after year. Then the annual growth of prices does not get affected by the fact that it is black. I hope that answers the question.
I think we have time for maybe one last question. Ela, we've come to almost half an hour since we started this. This is a regular viewer, Hitesh Nautiyal. Thank you, Hitesh. Thanks for watching us every week. Thanks for asking questions every week. We enjoy answering your questions. Hitesh is asking, do you think it is necessary to cut interest rates on small saving schemes in order to control inflation in the times to come? I mean, this has been the hottest topic in the last 2-3 days, although not because it is connected to inflation. Uh, I mean, your thoughts on the rate cut and the fact that Hitesh says, is it necessary to cut those rates to tame inflation?
So let's first start with, what do you do when inflation goes up? Do you cut rates or do you raise rates? And Hitesh is saying that when inflation goes up, you cut rates. On the contrary, when inflation goes up, you raise rates. So I think there's a problem with the question to begin with. That just understand that what do you try to do when inflation goes up? When inflation goes up, you try to reduce credit growth. You try to raise rates so that people have less money with which they demand less products. So it is not correct to say that for taming inflation, is it necessary to cut rates? It's in fact the other way around. So forget about the fact that we're talking about small savings rate for the time being. Just the fact that we're talking about interest rates. Interest rates are actually raised when you try to control credit growth. And when inflation is high, when prices are rising, when demand is too much, when demand exceeds supply, you want to control demand. And so you want to raise rates. That's one part of the story. I think on the other, let's turn to small savings rates. So I think in the present context, small savings rates would have been cut because the general level of interest rates has gone down rather than gone up. So because we have been cutting rates, RBI has been cutting rates consistently. So if we could, maybe in a link, share the same graph that we shared last time, it might be useful to relook at that graph, because that will show how the repo rate has been cut consistently by the RBI. Now, when rates have been cut, then you want the small savings rate, because rates across the economy are lower, for banks to be able to attract deposits when small savings rates are high becomes difficult, because then banks would want to keep their rates up to be able to attract deposits. So in consequence, the small saving rate, so there was a committee, a Ministry of Finance committee, that had recommended that the small savings rate be linked to market interest rates. And that makes its regular recommendations. And though that's not what I read in the press, but I suppose, I imagine, I assume that somewhere the committee would have made its recommendation to cut rates for small savings, because that rate is linked to the 91-day treasury bill rate, which would be lower because of rate cuts in the economy. So since it was set last year, it would have been lower now. But of course, given that it's in the middle of an election, it was strange that it should be cut at this time. It never happens in the middle of an election. So I guess it was rolled back, not because you want small savings rates to be high, but because it was politically not the right time to do it. Otherwise, small savings rate should be linked to the general level of interest rates.
That was a little bit of egg on the face of whoever took that decision, unfortunately. Thank you so much for watching this episode. We had a very good 30-minute discussion today, like we always do every Friday. And we are really thankful for you for watching us. We will be back next week, next Friday. We don't know what the news cycle has in store for us, but we will make sure that we are on top of it. Thanks, Ila, and thanks for watching.